Alright folks, this is where it starts. This is 8/4 inch, meaning 2-inch, rough sawn, hard maple. As you can see, it's all kinds of milling marks, and generally speaking the boards are pretty uneven and not very straight. Totally varying widths. There's absolutely no rhyme or reason to how wide they're cut, other than probably what the tree was capable of offering. So we're going to take all these boards. These are all 10-footers. That one's a 9-footer for 36-inch tables. These are 120 inches, so we'll cut them into about 40-inch bits. They give you an extra inch, so it's actually 121 inches. So I divide that inch over the 3 boards. So you end up with just over 40-inch boards. So each of these will yield 3 table-length boards, which will then rip in half. I'll explain that later. And this 9-foot board over here, I'll take one 40-inch section for a 36-inch table, and then the rest of it, which is about 70 inches, I'll leave the 70-inch board for a 36 by 66-inch table, something like that. That's what these longer boards back here are for. Here, I can show you one of those tables that's done. There, on the bottom. That's that, so we'll cut them all up. Okay, one thing I forgot to mention in that last video. When you're measuring these things up to cut them, you gotta take into account, especially on a 9-foot board like this where you're gonna get 2 different length tables, which face is going to be the one that gets used, and how long to cut each board as a result. So like here, there's an imperfection. That will probably plane out, but you never know how deep it goes. Could just be a sliver hairline crack that goes halfway through. So, and then on the back side, there's a big knot with a void in it. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna use this piece here. We're gonna cut this in about, 2/3, 1/3. And for this piece, this is gonna be the bottom. And for this piece, this is gonna be the top. All right, there we go. Most of those boards have been cut in thirds. There's that one 70-inch piece. I ended up not cutting everything up. I think I actually overbought lumber, which is a good thing. So now we're going to run each of these boards through the jointer on one side, just roughly, the point of which is to not get a perfectly right angle, which is normally what a jointer is used for, on one side, but actually just to make one of the edges perfectly straight, so that we can run it along our table saw with the straight edge on the fence and rip the boards in half. So here we are at the jointer. We're going to run these boards along the fence just like that over the cutter head, and we're going to adjust the infeed table as needed, which I'll describe later, to cut off only what we need. Some of these boards are going to be damn near straight. This one's not too bad, and some of them are going to have a gnarly bow in them. So if it's got a bow, we're going to drop the infeed table to take off more of that bow and make that bow straight. But for this one, we'll probably only need to shave off, looks like maybe a 1/16 of an inch, maybe an 1/8 of an inch, something like that. And then one edge of each board will be straight. So we just ran this board over the jointer. I hope you could hear it. The first pass, there was more of a load on the motor that drives the cutter head on the either end of the board, and there wasn't as much in the middle, meaning there was a little bit of a bow to it. So after the first pass, I knew that I shaved off a bunch here, and a bunch here, probably didn't get much in the middle, so I did a second pass, and then the sound of the motor, you could hear an even load all the way across, so I knew that there was constant material removal all the way along the edge, so that the edge is straight. Alright, here we are at the table saw. All of these boards have had one edge straightened, and so now they can ride along the fence, and just cut them all right down the middle. Alright, all these boards have been ripped in half, including the two from the 9-foot board. And now what we're going to do is joint one face of each of these boards on the jointer, and that will take what is probably pretty close. You can see there's some variation down that line. We're gonna make that perfectly flat. We do so on the jointer over here, just like we did with the face the first time, or I'm sorry, with the edge to get a straight edge. We do the same thing, but instead of looking for a straight edge, we're looking for a perfectly flat face. So as we pass it over the cutter head here, whatever hangs below the cutter head on the infeed table gets removed, and the cutter head is perfectly in plane with the outfeed table. So you end up with a perfectly flat surface. Alright, all these boards have been jointed on one face down. So now that we have one perfectly flat surface, we're going to run them through the thickness planer. Some of the boards are going to require more planing than others. Like you can see, this one is quite a bit thinner on one side. So unfortunately that means the whole, everything else on the board, this and all the way down, has all got to get planed off in order to clean this up. And that's why you end up with this. This thing generates a lot of shavings, but that's what makes our boards perfectly parallel and straight and flat. Okay, all of these boards have been run through the planer, and now we have two perfectly parallel, flat faces. The edges, on the other hand, are far from parallel or perfectly flat. So we go back over to the jointer. Couple points on using the jointer. When you run a board over it, you never want to put weight on the in-feed table. That will push the board down into the cutter head and actually cause exactly what you're trying to get rid of. Bowing, that kind of thing. So as you feed the wood over, you always want to put the weight on the outfeed table. And if you're planing a face of a board, you want to press down good and hard on the outfeed table as the board passes over. And if you're planing the edge, as we're going to do now with all of those, since we have a perfectly flat and straight reference, grab a push pad and press the wood up against the fence. And you want to put all of your weight in this direction and then just simply move it forward over the cutter head. Never pressing down until you're past the cutter head. But when you're jointing an edge, the point is to put your weight up against the fence so that the edge riding on the infeed table and the outfeed table comes out perfectly square to the fence. I just want to demonstrate why it's so important to, when you're joining the edge of a board, to press against the fence and not against the infeed table. Since we know that the faces are parallel and straight, but the edges are not. They could be anything but, and usually are anything but. So as you're feeding this over the cutter head, if you press down, you can see the gap that it creates between the fence and the board. And all that's going to do is remove material and maintain the exact same angle between the edge and the face that already exists. What you're trying to make here is a perfect right angle so that when you glue the boards together, there's no gap and they don't slide up and down too much. So when you press back, you can actually see it transfers the gap to the edge of the board, which is where we're trying to remove it, not here. Alright, all of these boards and those have been jointed on one edge, the edge that's down. Now the goal is to make the opposite edge, the edge that's up on all these boards, perfectly parallel to the jointed edge. You can't just flip the board over and run the top edge over the jointer. They wouldn't end up being parallel. They would both be straight, but they would not be parallel. What most guys do is run it over their table saw, which my planer is sitting on top of right now, running the jointed edge along the fence and allowing the table saw to square up the opposite edge. My table saw sucks and does not do a very good job of that. You get stuff like this from a saw blade, and it just doesn't do a very good job. I tried doing it and nothing looked good. So what I've been doing is cranking up the planer and running the boards and the planer through vertically. And when you end up with boards like this, that's not too bad actually. Some of these boards are going to be wildly uneven, like have a peak that's, you know, a quarter of an inch taller than the rest of the board. It takes quite a few passes through this thing to get them all totally planed to the point where when you put it through the planer, it's evenly removing material. But that's what I've got that works, so that's the way I do it. So here we have boards that are, for the most part, straight, true, perpendicular, all the things. I'm sure there's little bits of imperfection, but we'll pick that up later. Next we bring them over to lay them out and glue them up. So here's the layout before the glue up. You can see all the different boards are different heights, different thicknesses. So we're going to make them all the same. A couple important things to note. We have alternating grain patterns. I don't know if I can get this light enough just for you to see it, but this one's up, this one's down, this one's up, this one's down, this one's up, this one's down. That's to minimize the table being anything but flat. So if any of these boards decide to cup a little bit, the alternating grain pattern will not result in an exaggerated cupping of the whole table. Instead, it'll cup in alternating directions, if that makes sense. So you end up with a pattern like that instead of a pattern like that. Also, most of these boards have some kind of imperfection on one end. So generally I try and line them all up with the good side all on the same side, and the imperfections on the other side, like this, and this, and this, and there's one with a big crack. Oh yeah, here's a big, so that'll all get cut off in the end. So when I cut these things square, after the table's all glued up, I'll only cut maybe a ½ an inch or something off of this end. These will all be lined up when I glue it up, you'll see. And then I'll cut like 4 inches off of this end. So I always give myself 4 to 5 inches of excess. It's going to be a 36-inch table, and these are about 40.5 inch long boards. One other note, a couple other notes I guess on this layout before I glue this table up. In the last video I said we're going to make all of these varying thickness boards the same thickness. We'll do that with the planer. And the other thing, you can see all of these boards have lines on the end here. That's called snipe, and that is a result of the board coming out of the planer and not being supported, and basically the unsupported end dropping down, causing the end that's still inside the planer to go up and hit the cutter head. So they're all the exact same length of snipe. So basically this is a little bit higher and this is a little bit lower. I don't know if I can. It's very minor, and it's exaggerated by the lighting in here, but it's a good opportunity to kind of explain what that is. As I plane these all down and make these all the same thickness, I'll pay a little bit more attention to the boards being supported as they come out, and the snipe will be minimized. And also, in my experience, this sands out and you can't see it at the end of the project. So, but just wanted to explain what those lines are all about and how we're going to go about making these all evenly thick. Okay, here we are again. We're going to make these things evenly thick. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the tallest boards, like this one, and this one, and this one, and start at the highest height on the planer and gradually tighten the planer down until we find the narrowest board, probably this one, and we'll just shave the tiniest little bit off of this, and then leave the planer set at that height, that depth, no, it would be height, and then run the rest of the boards through it without adjusting the cutter head. Alright, we're back. This thing's set up for the thickness. As I stick that under there, you can see it's taken short of the 1/16 of an inch off. So we'll lock the cutter head down, which helps reduce the snipe. Turn this thing on. It's going to get loud, and I'll show you how we plane. So you can see as the board was coming out of the planer, this end is hanging off, and if it drops down like this, I'm exaggerating, it'll push this end up into the cutter head, and that's where you get that little bit of snipe from. As you can see, I was paying more attention to it this time. There's no snipe on that. Alright, all these boards have been run through the planer at the same thickness. They're not all totally sitting flat right now, but they are the same thickness. So now at this point, what we do, since they're all even, I have just the tiniest little bit of pressure applied across each of these parallel clamps, and we're going to, before we glue everything up, we're going to look for imperfections in the joints and fix them, like right here. These boards are not joined very well. There's a gap. So earlier in the process, as I showed you guys, my pile's getting small now, but all of these boards were, you know, roughly prepared to maximize whatever thickness we could, and they were jointed. But you know, as they sit here, they take on moisture and let moisture go, and they change a little bit, and so now we got to clean them up one more time. So some of them may have, excuse me, bowed a little bit or twisted a little bit or any number of things, so we'll run them through the jointer as we need to. Sometimes it's hard to tell if a joint has a gap or if there's just a shadow from it not sitting square, so I tend to pound them back down into place like this one. That looks like it might be a bad joint, but it's actually just a shadow. See, they snug right up. So sometimes you, same thing here and here. So yeah, I'll just go joint by joint and mark which ones need to be touched up, like this right here. That's a gap right by that knot. So yeah, we'll just we'll take all the imperfections back out and then we'll glue it up. So the point with this thing is to get the edge that you're going to glue up to the board next to it as square as possible, square and straight, so there are no gaps. How a jointer works is this cutter head here. This thing rotates. There's 3 blades on it. In-feed table and out-feed table. The out-feed table is fixed and perfectly flush with the cutter head. Kind of hard to tell what they are. And then the in-feed table goes up and down. So you can remove various amounts of wood from in front of the cutter head, and whatever comes past the cutter head sits on the outfeed table, and in theory is perfectly flush with the outfeed table. Obviously this board is not, it needs to be rejointed. You can see there's a gap right here, or maybe it's sitting on top of a little piece of, little shaving of wood. Sometimes that happens. So to joint these boards up, just to fix them in order to glue them up, we don't need to take much off because none of the gaps are more than, you know, 32nd of an inch or something like that. So just a tiniest little bit that is a 32nd of an inch right there. So you probably even take less off than that, but that's the idea. All right, we're back here again one more time, and everything's been jointed up, you know, on a fine-tuned level. Looks pretty good. This guy right here, I ran through a number of times. I can't get that to seal up. It's got to do with this knot. When you run the knots over the joiner, they like to come off in chunks as opposed to clean shavings, and I just can't get that to come out any cleaner. Probably sharpening of the cutter head would fix that, but hopefully it'll kind of round over when we sand it up a little bit. Otherwise, everything else looks pretty square and gap free. So now we'll glue her up. Okay, here's the glue up. At least the application of the glue. Got Tight Bond 2 wood glue. All the boards are vertical. They'll just be flopped back down this way, except for this one, because this edge will mate with that one. About a 1/4 inch bead on each board, and you just take a glue brush and flatten it out. Try and get some good surface area. Sometimes you can go like this a little bit. You just want good coverage. You can do that on all these boards, lay them down, and then squeeze them together. Alright dudes, here you have it. Sorry I couldn't shoot while I was doing it. You only get a little bit of time to lay everything down and clamp everything up before the glue starts to dry. So I can explain it now though. Obviously this glue being squeezed out, that's about what you're looking for. That kind of indicates you had the right amount of glue on. 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch of squeeze out. The parallel clamps obviously are pulling all the boards together this way. There's quite a bit of pressure on them. If there were any gaps between them, I want to close them up and obviously make good contact for the glue. And then these things going across are called cauls, C-A-U-L, and they're basically, I mean, pinch it together like this, try and keep the tabletop as flat as possible. On the outside, you can get cauls on the top and the bottom. So usually on the outside of the table, the edges of the table, the boards are damn near perfectly flat. Same thing over here. But of course you can't get clamps on the bottom of the middle of the table, so you can only clamp on the outside edges. So you do tend to get some rise and fall from board to board here, which you end up having to sand down. But yeah, and I know it looks like a lot of clamps, but the more clamps, the better job you do here, the easier your sanding job is, and sanding sucks. So it's good to take the time, try and get everything as square and flat and perfect as possible here so you don't have to fix it later. Alright, we're back here at the glue up. It's been a couple hours. You can take the clamps off. They say after 30 minutes, but I usually leave the parallel clamps on for at least 10 hours, something like that. Take the cauls off though. You can tell it's done. The glue is all set up. It changed from like a kind of a white, creamy ivory color to this yellow. So we'll take all these clamps off and scrape all that glue off before it really sets up. Once it turns rock hard, it'll almost turn translucent. And if you wait until that point to scrape it off with a chisel, it tends to tear out wood from the joint. The glue itself is actually stronger than the wood. So it doesn't like to let go, and when you chisel it off, a lot of the time it'll take wood with it. We don't want that, obviously. Alright, all of the clamps have been removed except for the bottom parallel clamps. One thing I forgot to note earlier, anything that's going to come in contact with the squeeze out, the glue squeeze out, should be covered in packing tape. So you can't really, here you go, there's some packing tape on here. Same thing with the cauls. They all need to have packing tape on them. Otherwise the glue, you'll just glue your cauls to the table. We don't want that. So, let's see. Chisel, nice sharp chisel. What we do is, for the most part, then you end up with these blotches. Some of that'll scrape off, but if not, it'll come off from the sander later. It is best to try and get as much of this off as you can, because what you don't tends to gum up your sanding discs and belts. There it is, all scraped down. No more glue, except for this joint here. About 2/3 of it, maybe a little bit more. Not the greatest edge there. This board is sitting a little higher than that one. That's why the glue scraped out completely on this side and not on this side. Same thing over here. It's always the outside boards. I don't know, I'm sure it's something I'm doing wrong. But this is, I'm learning this all by trial and error, and I've had nothing but error so far. That will sand out. I'm just going to take a little bit more sanding. It sucks, but I haven't figured out what I'm doing wrong yet. Now I'm going to flip the table up on the ends of these clamps so I can scrape off most of what's on the bottom. There you have it. Still in the clamps, sitting up on the edge. I'm just going to scrape all this glue off in between all the clamps, then lay it back down. Next, we're going to trim off the excess from the ends of the glued boards. As if you recall from the layout, I talked about one edge being all put together, and we'll just trim a little bit off. This is the edge with some of the defects. This particular table, there's this one. Unfortunately, this one, and that ain't going anywhere. That's just going to be there. Nothing we can do about that. And there's also this one. So all in all, we got to trim off maybe at least 3 inches from this end. Unfortunately, we also had some bum joints. That's pretty lame. And that one's not very good either. It looks like they're largely due to snipe from the joiner or the piner. So we got to cut at least an inch off here too, so we're going to cut it tight. I'll cut this end off first and then measure 36 inches from there, and then we'll see what we get left. To make this cut square and straight, we've got 2 rafter squares and a straight edge. It's this far over because the table saw, this is 5 inches from the blade to the end of the guide on the fence, or on the saw. And when we cut it, this will ride right along this straight edge clamp, and we'll end up cutting off about 1.25 inches. Alright, we cut that little bit of trim off there, perfectly straight, perfectly square. Now we'll measure 36 inches from here to that end and cut that end off, same way. Okay, here we have a squared up table ready for sanding. We start with the belt sander, and I generally go 45 degrees to the grain over the, focusing my efforts on the high joints. This one actually turned out pretty good. This board's sticking up a little bit higher than everything else, so these joints will get a lot of attention with the belt sander. Once the belt sander, which is very good at removing material rapidly, is done, we'll move over to the random orbital sander. I have 80 grit on here, and it will leave a fair number of scratch marks in the wood when we're done with the belt sander. But then when we move to the random orbital sander, we'll start with 40 and sequence all the way through 60, 80, 100, 120, 150, finally 220, and then a 400 hand sanding. And it will look pretty good when we're done with it. Back at this table again prior to sanding, I forgot to mention, you sand both sides, even though the underside will probably never be seen by anybody. The pros here in Minneapolis told me that even removal of material on both sides is important to maintain flatness of the table. If you sand only one side of it, it has a tendency to be more prone to cupping. Here we have a knot with quite a big void in it. This board, I didn't look on the other side, but the only reason I would leave that in is if there's something even worse on the other side. So what we're going to do, and I've never done it before, is fill it with 2-part 5-minute epoxy. It should dry crystal clear. It'll just look like it's full of polyurethane. Some guys add black pigment to this stuff to make it match the knot. I figured I'd take one step at a time. Okie doke. This has been belt sanded with 80 grit, front and back, and then orbital sanded 40, 60, 80, 100, and 120 grit. Top and bottom, front and back, whatever, and sides as well. And before we go on to the finish sanding, we're going to route these sharp corners off with an 1/8 inch round over bit. Okay, I had to move inside. Got dark on me quick. This has been edge routed with that 1/8 inch round over bit. This is what you get instead of a sharp corner. Bottom edges, top edges, and the corners. And then both faces, the top and the bottom. Sorry, my camera's struggling here. Have been finish sanded with 150 and 220. Just want to follow up on the 5-minute 2-part epoxy that was put in this void prior to polyurethaning. It looks pretty much just like it should. It just looks like it's full polyurethane. It's hard, it's flat, and that worked pretty well. Last but not least, we seal these things up with some sort of finish. I chose to use spar urethane since these tables will probably be covered in beer and condensation from the glasses and stuff. Spar urethane is very good with moisture. Won't leave rings or anything like that. But you can use anything you want. Important thing to note, just like with sanding, is you got to seal the whole thing. You can't just seal the tops and the sides. That would allow the moisture in the atmosphere and the wood to interchange differently between the top surface and the bottom. And sealing the whole thing helps keep the tables flat. I did 4 coats each of spar urethane. I did 2 on the top, then I flipped it over, did 4 on the bottom. I flipped it over and did the last 2 on the top, sanding with 400 grit between each coat and finishing at the very end with 600 grit. And all you gotta do after this is throw it on top of a steel table base. That's the end.